Now that we've gone through how to apply flares and make basic adjustments, let's jump into the nitty-gritty and learn how to control the bits and pieces of a flare and how to make them yourself. So when you're going to do this level of editing, you do it by double-clicking on a swatch. That will open up the flare editor. Now before we do that, let's point out something. Up here in your bin, this is sort of your library of where you store all the flares that you want to reuse. Notice that when we click on this button here, the highlight appears around the swatch up here. If I double click here, it's going to open up the flare editor and I'll be editing the flare that's in the bin. Got that? It's the flare that's in the library. So it's not actually going to edit anything that's in the scene here. It's going to edit the one that you're keeping around to reuse later. If I click here and double click here, you'll see now the highlight appears on this swatch, and I'm going to be editing the one that's currently being used on that track. Got that? So let me show you one of the differences. Now, if I can make them both be the same thing. For instance, when I drag down to here and let go, you'll notice that it changes the name. Instead of Club Strike, it's now Club Strike number 1. Okay, that's because it's made a copy. It's assuming that you want to keep this one around. Okay, so you'll notice that the highlight changes based on which one I click on. Okay, watch this though. If I hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows and drag down, now you see how the name just says Club Strike, and it's the same as that one right up there. Okay, when I select this one, I get the highlight around both of these. Okay, same thing happens if I deselect. Well, let's say I click on this one here. You see I'm always going to get the highlight around both of them. That's because the names are identical, so I'm actually editing the same thing. If I don't want to do that, don't hold down the Option key when you drag it in. Just drag it down like that. It makes a copy, updates everything in your scene, and then you see now this one says implants number 3 instead of straight implants. So that's just something to keep in mind. I want to adjust this one, so I'm going to double click here, and that's now going to open our flare editor, and this is where all the magic happens. The preview window right here is as you click and move around. I'm clicking and dragging right now. You can see how the flare is updating in our preview window. Okay, it's made up of a bunch of different stuff. This is the stack over here. So you can see it's all these separate pieces that have items turned on, that have little checkbox. If I want to add more items to the stack, I can just turn them on here or here or here or here. Now this stack has a layer order to it. All right, anyone who's used to compositing programs know that the layer order can be very important. So basically it's very simple. What's at the top of the stack up here is on the top of the part of the flare. What's at the bottom of the stack down over here will be underneath everything else. Okay, so sometimes you have to keep this in mind, especially when you're using blend modes. Most of these look like they're set to normal or add. So for the most part, that's going to be fine. But I'll give you an example. If I change this one from add to normal, you're going to see how it changes the look. Right there, that little glow, when I change it from normal to add, you see it definitely changes the look of the glow. So just keep that sort of thing in mind. Now, you can copy and paste these guys around. If you select it first and then do Command or Alt C, or I'm sorry, Control C on Windows, and then say I'm going to paste it down over here. I'm going to select this and do Command V on the Mac or Control V on Windows. Now I've got the identical thing in both places, but check out what happens. You see when I turn this on, it's now at the bottom of the stack, and it has a very different look than it does when it's at the top of the stack. All right, so again, keep in mind that the look is going to change based on where you position these. There is no way of just dragging and dropping these in between each other. You always have to do a copy and paste. So this guy we're done with, so we can just turn him off and we'll leave this one there. Okay, now there are two basic elements that you need to be aware of. There are glow elements and spike elements. So you can go through here. This turns the visibility on or off, and this little button here solos it. So that'll turn everything else off except for just the one little piece that you're looking at. So it's really easy to help find things. So you go here, okay, that's the big glow. That's the sharp center of the spike. That's the three-pronged, sort of a bit of a fan there, but those are the long ones. I'm sure the next one down here is going to be the short ones, right? That's the short ones. Nothing right there. Multi-iris, so that's the big long piece right here. And then of course single iris is that big one right there being used all by itself. Okay, and when you add these all together, you get a complete looking flare. So the first thing we're going to be talking about are the glow items. So let's see. You know what? I'm going to, well, let's just solo this one out so you can see it all by itself right now. Okay? So glow items, in this particular case, down here you see there are glow elements or spike elements. That's where you choose them. And these are all the controls that make this glow look like it does. Obviously there's the basic color. You also have gradients. You can work with gradients or textures. Load in textures to create really interesting one-of-a-kind type flares. The alpha channel, you can just scrub these things. Okay, that's a way of dimming it out or brightening it up. This is very important. This is the type of fall off that's being used for this particular glow. This controls the minimum level of fall off. So if I boost this up, you see the minimum keeps raising. And if I pull this down, this is the maximum fall off. So that's the maximum brightness. This is like the minimum brightness and the maximum brightness. Okay. Right now the radius for this is huge. That's why you'll notice that when we set it up to minimum, when we set the minimum higher, you'll notice that it really starts to bleach everything out. Let's pull this down quite a bit just so you get an idea about what's going on. Okay, there's a nice little silly glow to work with. So you can see here, this glow actually extends this far out. And that's used so that we get this really nice shading as it goes off. Okay, so when this is down, see, this is what swoop down looks like. Okay, constant is just a constant color all the way across. Linear is a linear fall off from the center out to the edge. Okay, exponential is an exponential fall off where it holds and then drops off much quicker. Swoop down starts very sharp, drops quickly, and then slowly fades out. Okay, swoop up does the opposite. It starts at 0 and then swoops up very quickly, holds low and then swoops up at the end to give you a bright outer edge. Hump starts low, swoops up, then comes back down at the end. Okay, and then we have a sharp hump, which swoops up quicker, holds at a constant rate, and then swoops down. And then sharp hump 2 is even sharper than that, where it swoops up very quickly and then holds at a constant rate, then pulls down. These were added so that we could do the ring effects, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then edge highlight just gives you a nice little highlight at the edge. You'll see that one's different than swoop up, because swoop up is much bigger. Edge highlight gives you just a nice little tiny edge. That's for doing those iris effects where you've got just a little bit of a glow around the edge of the iris. Okay, and we'll show you how to combine that with this minimum level as well. Okie doke, so if we put this back to linear, take a look at that and show you what this is doing. So let's go through these so you can tell what's going on. Stretch, of course, changes the shape of the glow. Number of sides. When it's at 0, it creates a perfect circle. When it's anything else, it's going to give you a shape. So if I set this up to 3, 4, 5, let's say we're going to do a hex ring. So if we set it to 6, we get a nice little hex ring. This is where we can go now to like edge highlight and then set a minimum like that, and then pull the radius down. You see that's now one of our iris effects. So we can pull maybe the alpha a little bit lower and give us a little more brightness in the center. So you see now with that and a little bit of stretch, maybe even some rotation, we've got a really nice iris to drop into the middle of our glows. The blur will add an extra level blur on top of this. So if you add that, you see it'll blur out the outside edges too. Okay, and then let me turn stretch off just for a second so it's a little more clear what's going on. And also notice that the edges themselves are curved. So that would be our roundness setting right here. So if we set that to 0, you get sharp edges. As you start dialing that in, you get a little bit of rounding, and then more and more rounding until, of course, you end up with a complete circle. So that's what roundness does. Number of objects. This is what you use when you're creating the multi-iris effects. Also with spread and focus, those are all related to the multi-iris. So to show you how this works, let's say we get ourselves like 5 objects. Okay. Now the spread is how much, if you consider 0 is going to be the the position of the flare itself. So our 0 point, if I'm clicking right here, our 0 is going to be set right here. Now notice half of them are to one side and half of them are to the other side. That's because over here our axis is set to 0. So the 0 point is where the spread is going to start. Okay, but now our spread is set to 50. A spread of 0 to 100 is a complete spread between the flare point, the center of the scene, the center of your camera lens, and then the opposite side. So from the opposite side to the flare point itself is considered to be 0 to 100. Got it? So when we set spread to 50, it means that it's going to take half of that distance for the spread, and now it's going to center them on this axis right there. So if I set spread up to 100, this now is going to be the entire length between here, the center, and over, but now it's still centered around the axis. So now when I bring the axis up to some other number, you see now we're getting something that looks like a normal sort of multi-iris effect, and that's because our lens is here where I'm clicking, and then it's reflecting across the center of the camera lens over to the other side for a complete spread of 100. So this is how you make these multi-iris guys. We can increase these. Let's lower the radius a little bit. So we've got them like that, and we could actually add a bunch more objects if we wanted to. And now this brings us to our color random. What color random does is that will offset the base color. This is the base color right here, by an amount that you specify. All right, so you can get some completely random looks, or you can keep them all around the same base color like that. Now color random works with the random seed down here, so if you don't like exactly what it's set to, you can just click up or down and it'll keep, or type in a different number to get a different random seed until you have a random pattern that you sort of like. Okay, so that's pretty good. And let's see, spreads 15 line. Let's spread these guys out a little bit more, and I'll show you what the focus does. Now focus is interesting. Say we blur these guys. If you've ever looked at how these things actually look inside of a real camera, you'll notice that in a multi-iris effect like this, there's a position in the iris reflections that's going to be in focus. The ones to one side are going to be out of focus, and the reflections to the other side are also going to be out of focus. But there's always going to be one that's more in focus than anything else. Okay, so we have a focus setting right here. When you set that down to 0, it's going to push the focus up to the end that has the which is closest to the flare, closest to the center of the object itself. Okay, when you push the focus towards 100, you're pushing the focus out to the end, so it's clear over there. So usually somewhere between 0 and 100 is where it ends up being, but we give you the ability to craft that focus so it looks the way that you want to make it. All right, it's pretty cool. We also have controls here for randomizing the spread, because of course these are never regular. So you can randomize the amount of spread. You can randomize the radiuses of these guys. Okay. By the way, the radius also works with focus, so that you'll notice that as they get more out of focus, they get bigger. Okay, so you can pull the focus up and down, and it'll adjust the size of the iris pieces as you're going along. You also have control over the randomization of the brightness, because that always happens. And there you go. That's sort of like a basic discussion of how to work with the random guys and how to create these individual glows. Now the one other thing that's worth talking about are the offsets and the tracking. Okay, so right now it's tracking both. You see, it's when we're talking about tracking, we're talking about it's following, and in this case reflecting across the x-axis and across the y-axis. So when we set it to track only x, it means that it's going to track any x motion, but it's only going to follow with a y motion. Okay, and for if we track the y, the opposite is going to happen. It's going to follow the y, and then it's going to reflect. I'm sorry, it's following the x motion, but then it's actually reflecting across the y. Okay, now this is useful when you're setting up like digital types of reflections. So let's turn the blur off, because these usually aren't blurry, and we'll set up some boxes, and we'll stretch these little box guys out a little bit, and then remove. Let's lower the radius. Okay, so we've got, here we go. We'll now have essentially what's very close to digital reflections. Okay, let's increase the number of elements. Okay, very good, very good, very good. So now you'll notice that it's tracking, but it's tracking exactly where my cursor is. Okay, so what I can do with this is, there we go, is offset. So I can adjust this offset by pulling this up like this. And now what I can do is I can copy and I'll paste it here and then adjust this offset in the opposite direction. All right. And that did absolutely nothing. What's going on? Oh, I've got it soloed out. So I got to solo this one too. There we go. Now that both of them are soloed, we're able to see them at the same time. Okay, so I can get it like this, and of course I can adjust one of them so it's got, you know, a slightly different pattern. Maybe change the stretch a tiny bit and blur these guys out. Blur this one like this, so we've got a slightly different look to these guys. That looks much better. Okay, and then pull the focus over. Excellent. Okay, so that is now looking pretty good. Okay, so that's a quick overview of how the glow settings work. So we've gone over the different types of things. If you play around with these, you'll see some really cool things that happen. But these are here. Oh gosh, rings. We haven't talked about rings at all. So let's do that. Let's turn this off. I'm going to turn this one back on and solo it out so that I can show you a ring. Now, ring size works like this. And then you change it from like linear to one of these hump styles. So you get this nice little hump in the gradient pattern. Okay, so say you wanted to create a color ring. We can adjust that, pull the saturation down, maybe dim it out a tiny bit like that, and then pull the ring size out even farther and reduce the, whoop, not that far, and then reduce the alpha down, and you've got yourself a perfect little flare ring. Okay, so there you go. There's a quick overview of how these guys work and how the glow elements work too.